Why knowledge matters.
You really decipher and take it apart what the nature and its laws, you know, how it best predicts to somehow our future. And please tell and elaborate on that, how the nature and its laws really is a way of, to some extent, predicting the future, and especially our future as a species.
Yeah, I'll give you two examples. One's the law of corridors, and one's the law of natural selection or evolution. So, the law of corridors is something that ecologists and conservation biologists have worked on for a while in order to understand how to connect conservation landscapes as species migrate with climate change. And so they know that if you create a bigger corridor for species that are more likely to be able to move with climate change, you're more likely to get a mountain lion moving north, or uh, uh, a forest dependent owl if you've got a good corridor of habitat. And so that's a law like feature of the living world. And most species on Earth are going to have to move as climate changes. But one of the fun things with the book is I could then also consider what are the other implications of that law. And one of the ones that seem to have gone unnoticed is that, yes, it's true if you make more forest as a corridor, that forest species will move. But it's also true if you make more of some other habitat, that those species will move. And so if you look at Eastern North America, for example, what kinds of corridors have we made? Well, we've made a giant city that stretches almost from Atlanta to Boston with a couple of gaps. And it's a perfect corridor. It's just a corridor for species we don't like. And so here I'm taking this law-like feature of the living world, that if you connect habitat, species can move through them, and then connecting it with an awareness of what we've actually done, not what we hope we might do. And so that's one of the laws I tangle with in the book. And it's an example of what's obvious to ecologists, but not necessarily to a broader discussion. And then if you had a beer with an ecologist and you said, well, if you created a giant city from Atlanta to Boston, would all the city species be able to move north more quickly than any other species? And would we inadvertently favor species we don't like? They would all say, of course, that's the most obvious thing given what we know about corridors. I'm not going to write a paper about it because it's so obvious. Why do you even need to tell me? But in fact, it's not obvious if you don't think about corridors every morning. The same is true of natural selection. That when we went through the pandemic, one of the things you saw on lots of products was this kills 99.9% of germs. And I think in general we think of that as a good thing. But what the law of natural selection tells us is that that's exactly the wrong percent to kill. Because the other way to say that is favors point, point, point one, point zero, whatever the remainder of, favors that. The other way to say that is that this favors a small percent of germs that it doesn't kill. And what we know from natural selection is that those will be germs that have evolved resistance to whatever it is you're spraying. And and this seems like a little banal piece of the story, but you scale that up, and we predictably see the consequences of the overuse of antibiotics, of the overuse of pesticides, of the overuse of herbicides. And we know that that favors the evolution of new lineages and new species. That's defining feature is we can't kill them. And so there are a lot of these law-like features of the living world, of ecology and evolution, that that bear upon our lives all the time, but we don't think about it in that way. And then they rear up in these moments. Probably most of your viewers or listeners know somebody who's had a resistant staph infection, MRSA. Well, that's a direct consequence of kills 99.9% of germs. And it's a direct consequence we can feel, we know in our families, it affects us directly. And yet it seems esoteric. And so that's often what I'm trying to do, is to take this seemingly esoteric feature of the living world and how it works and bring it into your living room, bring it into your family, so that we can have conversations about it together, because there's no way that ecologists on our own can make the kinds of changes we need to make. We're a small, weird group, right? These are policy decisions. They're individual consumer decisions. They're everybody decisions. And we might not decide the way that most people want to decide. And so they're also the case that, my job is to lift up the understanding so that we can have the discussion, because the world I want might not be the mean world we collectively want. I hope it is, but might not be.
It is so true, and that's why it also opened me so much up to how I consider also where I live. There is, for example, in North America, here in northern Quebec, there's, for example, because of the roads now are built for, mining and people living here more and more, that, for example, too, these are also somehow like corridors, for example, for the wolves. Now they are able to travel much, much further, and that's why also they obviously they catch, more quickly, prey and so on, right? So that is so interesting, and you brought this in such a beautiful way into light for everyone, right? That we can have those discussion. On the other hand too, it's so interesting when you think, and that's why I like your book so much, is that whatever we build, even if we build like a new whatever, like houses, in the park and so on, of course it has a negative influence on the ecology overall, of course, but also, as you just said, it also built other corridors. Now the problem is that, as you mentioned, there is a lot of those animals, those species that we don't necessarily want, right? And that's the huge problem. So how do you think we can kind of start having a different approach, that we actually to somehow anticipate what you're saying, but also to cultivate, ecology that helps the species that we actually want and want to strive, including ourselves, in the future?
So, so I think there are a bunch of answers. What in the resistance context, what some people have begun to talk about is that susceptibility, the ability to be killed, is a kind of resource in those species we manage. And there are ways to manage, for example, pathogens to keep them susceptible. If we take care with our antibiotic use, we can keep them susceptible so that even if we're not eradicating them fully, when they're around, we can get rid of them. And so changing what we think of as the goal sometimes is helpful. I'll also say that in my last book, I took a poke at architects. I was talking about the living world in houses. And architects really responded, to their credit, positively. Quite a few architects reached out and said, look, I'm willing to make houses that are much more hospitable to more species that would benefit us. How do we work on it? And so I think, there's a version of that here, which is that urban planners, developers, a lot of people we wouldn't think about as natural allies, I think many of them are really open to having new conversations about how do we create these worlds with these law-like features in mind. And so I find that really very hopeful that there are these people willing to make bold change. And so I think the other element of this is, how do we stage those conversations? And Yannick, your forum here is a great example, so that we can start to talk together about, there's a national policy issue version of this, but I think what's more proximate to most of us is, how do we have these conversations in our own places? And so how do we create fora in which we can start to talk these through?
That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com.